welcome to Sense Space. Today, I'm here with Thomas Jockin, a philosopher who I've come to know just a little bit now through the net and through the philosophical scene surrounding the work of O.G. Rose. And we've been connecting a little bit already around some really interesting questions, cultural questions, political questions, but more foundationally, my interest in interfaith dialogue and coming into dialogue with someone who's really sitting between religion, and in particular the religion of Islam, and also philosophy. And for those of you who are following the work of John Vervaeke, you may be aware of his notion of the philosophical Silk Road and the importance of a search for a shared grammar, a universal grammar, a philosophical grammar through which we can begin to speak and mediate between religions and worlds. And this is immensely, immensely important. It's immensely high stakes, although I hope we'll bring levity to it. But the reality, as I see it, is that there is an enormous potential for conflict, not only in the context of Islam in the West, but the West and the Orthodox East and the West and China and so on. And so these kinds of cultural mediations and conversations are our best hope to find a new possibility and a new way through what can often seem like, there is no way through. So with that introduction, welcome, Thomas, and invite you to just introduce yourself however you prefer to be introduced.
Well, Jacob, first of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, as you said, I would caution to call myself a philosopher. I mean, my day job is a designer, so specifically a type designer. So I make fonts for digital font files that you can access online. And I work for different kinds of clients for that. And I also teach as a lecturer currently at the University of North Georgia in the visual art department, specifically in design. So I'm a specialist in that topic. You're all right that in terms of our chronology of encountering each other was through the net of Daniel Garner and of O.G. Rose. And I've been kind of constellating around that group with specifically Daniel and Michelle from O.G. Rose and Javier Rivera. The three of us wrote a little book called Philosophy of Glimpses. So that's available on Amazon. And we're currently working on our next book together. That's happening at the moment, which is really fun. Yeah, so I know I would talk to you off the record, right, in terms of our private conversations about mediation of different faith traditions and social political organization. That was brought up in the net, which is a kind of group gathering, how we met each other in the first place, organized by Daniel and Michelle from O.G. Rose. And the topic in question was how to mediate difference within society and cultures, right? And in particular, I brought up a very important part in that conversation where even that a lot of the social organization property is an act of privation, meaning there's some kind of oppressor-oppressed relationship or some kind of challenging that orients the group. So the group is defined by an outsider that is attacked or kind of directing aggression towards the body, the social body of the people or the entity. And people and identity is generated through that. So, for example, 9/11 led to a very us versus them mentality. Any kind of mode of us versus them, an othering occurs from a kind of privational attack on a social body. And I brought up that is a mechanism that the traditional Abrahamic religions has embodied in it by the discussion of the martyrs. The martyrs are a very important operation, both in Islamic tradition as well as Christian traditions as well, which is an orientation of that exact point of the kind of self-referential existence of those social bodies are from the blood of the martyrs, basically being reified by that. That has been how society has organized itself. So, which works, but as Daniel says many, many times over and over again in Belonging Again, in the book he wrote about this, that's fine. But if we want to not go down that route, which our intro said, right, we're entering a state where political, social tensions are coming arise again. If we do not want those kind of violent reactions to be the answer of how we're going to address the tension, there needs to be a very different kind of appreciation for social political relationships in the first place. So I kind of opened the note with that kind of summary point, and I want to hear your thoughts about that.
No, that's really good, and thank you for giving that context of. I'm loosely familiar with the ideas of René Girard, and it sounds like there's some consonance there. The notion of the blood sacrifice, and also that kind of in-group, out-group dynamic. It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast with Rory Stewart, who was a British politician and somebody who spent a lot of time. He was actually did like a walk across Afghanistan in 2001 and spent lots of time in the villages, and then later was a governor with the British occupation in Iraq. And he was talking about the difference between the Americans and the British. And he was saying that what he observed of the Americans in Iraq was there was this just like lack of willingness to recognize and appreciate the cultural differences of the people with whom they encountering, occupying, or trying to have diplomacy with. And that the British, at least from his perspective, seem to have a little bit more of a sensibility, possibly from their colonial exploits, I don't know, of kind of tuning into like, okay, what are these people's customs? How do they comport themselves, and how do we kind of meet them? And whether or not that has happened cynically, I'm sure it has in many instances. There's something there of like a perspective that is like very what he's kind of painting of the American is like a very confident worldview, but one that doesn't actually encounter otherness and doesn't really come into a relationship with otherness. And that's a really fascinating process for us to undergo, I think. And there's a lot of otherness to be encountered in the world today. Fortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I guess it depends how you frame it. We've mostly avoided delving into that, and that was the sensibility that I really started to grasp at university. Having a lot of dialogues with a woman I was in relationship with who was half Chinese, and hearing stories from China, and really starting to open up that world a little bit and appreciating the depth of difference. And then also having my first encounters with Islam and starting to understand, okay, different peoples have different histories, they have different stories, and those stories contextualize their present reality. Our stories and our maps, our sense of where we've come from determines how we interpret what's in front of us. And this is enormously important for diplomats, at a pragmatic level, to understand how the Chinese make decisions is going to be informed by a different worldview than how the Americans make decisions. But particularly in the context of Islam, appreciating like there is a historical consciousness really rooted in the foundational stories of the Quran and the stories of the life of the Prophet. And this is kind of the treasure trove of navigational wisdom and jurisprudence for Muslims as they move through history. And so I call that Islamic historical consciousness. And I suppose you could say there's a Christian or a Western historical consciousness, which also has its own kind of contingencies and conditions. So that's kind of a foundational understanding that I'm bringing to like how we even start to recognize difference. And I don't know if you agree that there is this kind of like flat landing, possibly of convenience, that occurs. Maybe it's necessary to a culture like America's, but that depth of difference and depth of distinction, I don't think often is really appreciated.
Well, I mean, it's the one subtle point, just on your example with that minister from Britain, just that distinction of Americans versus British dealing with the Afghanis. Power is an interesting thing because I know you made that reference to show like maybe one party is being a little more aware of difference than the other or otherness, but the kind of it would for me be more of a read about power differences, interpretation of power. What I mean by that is like the Romans, the Roman Empire, for example, was very aware of the others that were not Rome, um, and they were very aware of that, and they made it very clear and how they handle themselves when they were invading, basically conquering Gaul, for example, um, with very extreme, basically a genocide. um, but with that said, um, that's where to put this. I think also is interesting the modes. It's actually interesting the times and the moments when people try to emphasize the othering of others versus the try to communion of others.
Mm.
What I mean by that is uh, that the language, the association of the West, like when we put the West in the gigantic quotation marks like this, uh, by combining ancient Greece, but first of all, ancient Egypt, then ancient Greece, then Rome, then the developments of Western Europe, for example, ignoring the schism that occurred with Byzantine, for example, um, to generate out basically the Enlightenment period. This has been, at least when I was growing up, I was presented as that as a total as an American. That's our narrative structure, right? That's one whole entity of sameness. But if you study ancient Greek, like you go back to Plato and Aristotle, and you actually read what they say in their viewpoints. I was talking to friends about this. It's funny because this was presented as if this was because of the nature of democracy, right? That kind of through line was through ancient Greece, like through that line. Um, there's a lot of otherness in the Greeks compared to how we see ourselves today. Actually, I would say even more so, especially nowadays. The degree I would say, looking back at ancient Greek of Plato and Aristotle, I read it and realize how other we are. Every time I read it and take this seriously, the dialogues from Plato, I'm sensing a very vast otherness of
Mm-hmm.
an American Westerner reading this versus back then. I can give specific examples, but I always find that interesting, the choices of when things are brought together to basically wipe away the differences, and other moments where the differences are emphasized to kind of draw out the otherness. I find that interesting. I only say that too because, again, because we're talking geopolitical. The tension with Israel right now is clearly an example of that. Like, because at one point, being Jewish was a phenomenon associated with whiteness, right? And then now just that the interplay has been very different now. It's a very high stakes, high tension point. I'm seeing it in many different domains and spaces where, because of the oppression oppressor dynamic, it's becoming de-emphasized again on both sides of the equation. It's actually quite intense. By picking up historical narratives and historical events to draw out who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, and then also cross associations with that. So, for example, like the left kind of drawing out associations with Gaza. So Gaza has been now drawn out to be this political motion of liberation, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's put in tension with other parties and other members, especially when before Jewish identity was associated with the left. It was part of that coalition. So the intersectionality argument or framework of organization is right now in a massive tension. And for example, like I'm a graduate, my undergrad was at Parsons School of Design, New School. There's a massive teach-in occupation occurring at New School. Police arrests, violence, things like that happening. That's thank God nothing too serious, but enough. Uh, these are serious tension points that we're seeing in real time right now. And it's because, and I'm sensing this drawing of otherness and sameness being played out and new skis and tectonic plates, as you said in the beginning, Jacob, drawing out. I see that happening in real time.
Mm. Yeah, a lot of big pieces there. I I think I'll go chronologically. I think that's really interesting what you spoke to about the Greeks and that sense of, I mean, the founding fathers were very well versed in the Greeks, and they were well versed in Christianity and the Old Testament. And so those were definitely like big influences for them. And then, but as you say, there is this like kind of Western Christian claiming of the Greeks whilst completely glossing over, like, no, these people worshipped completely different gods, or a spread of different gods. They had a different theological landscape than we do. They also had the how would I call it? The Greek mystery school. Many kind of new historians are actually assessing that the mysteries for Greeks were a really important piece kind of behind those cultural developments. And that's a really interesting notion that is completely at odds with the Christian prohibition on any kind of pharmacological mystery school. And then, as you say, yeah, I mean, it's unavoidable that whatever is the most contemporaneous flashpoint in Israel Palestine is it right now becomes the driving context of the larger conversation, first of Islam in the West, but then also kind of within and between the West, intersectional social justice worldview, and more of a I mean, who to group on the other side of that, but both conservative and traditional liberal kind of worldview are both kind of contra to that. And yeah, there's a problem I see in it. For me, it's a problem, which is a kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of is the governing principle of intersectional leftism, and whomever is oppressed in any given context becomes the ally, and whomever is the oppressor in any given context becomes the enemy. But it's an absolute brain fucker, basically, because of this constantly flipping dynamic in which you have Israel as the minority state in the context of the Islamic world, the Islamic region, but then the majority state in the context of Israel in relation to West Bank and Gaza.
Yes.
Jews sometimes white. I think for the intersectional left, I think you alluded to, they're considered to be part of the white oppressor class that's been created. And but then that really doesn't jive too well with that historic oppressed condition. And they exist right between those. Jewish people live in a very fragile condition in the West, it seems, where they're not going to do well if the climate moves into a nationalistic, isolationistic cultural Christianity. Like if it moves more to the right, there's an anti-Jewish, anti-globalist vibe that propagates there. And if it moves too far to the left, there's another kind of anti-capitalistic, anti-oppressor class vibe that also works out poorly for Jewish people. So it's a tricky position.
It's a liminal identity at this point. It basically, yeah, So like it's basically it's on a knife's edge. It can go in either direction. And kind of draw your point, Jacob, about you're right, the founding fathers, right? They're very easy. They would quote right by biblical references, Greek traditions, but I think actually a very good demonstration of how other we are from the Greeks is the notion of virtue. If I use that term nowadays, it's going to get associated with moral goodness, like Victorian virtue. Like it's going to get associated with that. Like for example, you look it up in a dictionary, that's what you're going to get. That is not. I mean, that is a very compressed understanding of what virtue was for the Greeks. The better association is excellence, activity, excellence of activity, actualization of activity. And because, for example, like that is one account of Socrates, his great project was to find out what virtue is. That's what his project was, to the point he was willing to die for that. And even his students, especially Aristotle, his biggest project was Nicomachean Ethics, where it is a discussion about virtue as basically the means in which man gains happiness, right? That is something certain, and the fact that is the complexity of what that notion is, arete, in Greek versus what we understand virtue is now, is something, as one of my demonstrations very clearly show, a distinction of we're very different from them. So you use the same, that's the thing, is the words are very scary like that. Just because we use the same word does not mean it has the same reference. So we may seem on appearance to be saying the same thing, but in reality, we might be meaning very different things. This is actually very common. I mean, to get to the real meat of the point from a religious point of view is one of the most serious points of when we say God, whom and what are we referring to in the first place? That's always the problem at hand here is potential as misunderstandings or associations of things that were more in common than we might be, or maybe or the differences may be there that might be actual understandings that are there that might be mistaken. But also this is drawing out also what we say about organization by privation. Like if your identity and orientation is by privational states, meaning like things are by your enemies, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that kind of reference point, it sets up a very relative relation of instability. That's why I use the word liminal, like that kind of like knife's edge behavior. It definitely points to us having to think about this a little deeper, that maybe the presuppositions of orientation, as you pointed out, there's like all these different models, capitalistic, moral, social, that are interfacing with each other that might need another, where they're in an excited state at the moment. We're not really sure where it's going to end up in terms of a state of equilibrium. We're not sure about that yet. One last note is also to point out that it's funny because the interfacing of Plato Aristotle had a lot of work also with the Islamic tradition as well. Because because these texts were lost for a long time in the West. And it was because of Islamic scholars that they were maintained and they were commentated on. And those commentations on Aristotle and Plato, for example, were used by Thomas Aquinas, for example, for their work and their thinking. So for me personally, like kind of my work of kind of working through interfaith is using predominantly Catholic thinkers because of Aquinas's work, working with Islamic thinkers, to kind of find bridges of understanding that work that way too.
It seems to me that we think about, and bring it back to the United States, for example, notion of one nation under God was like what could be the most governing, unifying principle, which not everybody needs to define and distinguish exactly what that is, because it points to an ultimate unifying principle. It points to like whatever God is God. There's a sense, at least in the kind of mystical, the possibility of mystical unity points to the idea that all traditions are pointing to God. Some people will reduce that down to all monotheistic traditions are pointing to God. Okay. And then you can keep cutting it down and get narrower and narrower. But from my standpoint, having observed and journeyed with this question of Islam in the West, that that possibility of some sacred commonality is absolutely essential. And it's not clear to me what the other grounds for the commonality can be between Islam and Western societies. And it's complicated because the West has been in a post-Christian condition and a post-God condition for quite some time now. I'm not sure how that's going to evolve and change. But
Yeah.
what do you make of that as a shared basis? Like what do you think is the foundation of real interfaith dialogue? And then I suppose in the inverse, like what would be the great traps? What would be the great obstacles? I've been, just to confess, I've been an absolute skeptic of a lot of interfaith dialogue for most of my life, because what I saw was kind of priests and imams getting together and doing photo ops, but not seemingly really getting into the meat of the difference. And it also then followed that, okay, why can't they do that? What's going to take this from not even a real conversation, just like a political fronting kind of thing, into a dialogos, and
Yeah.
where can there actually be a real meeting there, from which then those really tricky differences can start to be understood and mediated.
Yeah. I mean, there's two parts of that. One part is, yeah, I would say, I mean, Daniel Gardner from OG Rose makes this comment all the time. We've used capital as our mode of coordination. So independent of a theological premise or universal principle, a theological premise to orient a society, capital and consumption has been the mode of organization. And it works, kind of. Kind of. And we're not the first one to deal with this. The Roman Empire had to deal with this exact problem. So that's how they handled this, more or less. They use generally things like the law. So, which we also do use. We also use an abstraction called the law as our universal principle, that all men are created equal under the law. Very, very close analogy that all men are created equal under God, right? But of course, as we saw from the Roman Empire, the problem is when the law no longer applies, whoopsie daisy, your organizing principle starts to fall apart a little bit. But your other part, or just kind of building on that, so the reason why the West has moved the way it did, at least my understanding of it, was when the Reformation occurred in the West, especially, we had 100 years of religious wars that killed 30% of Germany, for example. It was a bad time for everybody involved. So the general conclusion was, this is why I'm sympathetic to the Enlightenment period in that project, which was trying to address these issues of how are you going to deal with even Christianity having differences of interpretation, differences of theological questions. So say the basic summarize by saying, no, we're going to docket that. We're going to bracket these theological differences and say, no, we're not going to go use violence to deal with this problem. We're going to bracket those points and use another organizational property instead. Marketplaces, capital, things like that. That's a very abstractional read, and I'm certainly willing to acknowledge this is possible. Other possibilities. But I'm only saying that that's because that gives a context, even within Christianity, the differences of Reed, that led to huge conflicts. So if even in the same in the same organizational group called Christians, they have their differences can cause so much schism. Let alone, for example, like the Byzantine Empire in the West, the Catholic Christians, so like during the Crusades, unfortunately, there were some mishandlings that occurred at that time. If the differences even within a group can cause that much strife, cause violence, then your question about the photo op problem with imams and priests, for example, I'm not surprised, because to actually get in there with the differences, it will cause some significant issues, because there's almost ontological stakes at hand. And when people's ontologies get challenged, generally it gets very intense, very quickly. So that's part of the issue here.
What are you pointing to, though?
What do you mean?
Like that people experience an ontological challenge, and that kind of can produce conflict or produce escalation. Like what would that look like?
I mean, on different, like, for example, here's a very easy one. Is climate change real or not? There's a population that says, yes, it's real, and actually critically real. Look, we have to act now to save ourselves from climate change, versus another part of the population that says, no, it's not real. It's from an ontological stance, it's not real. Thus, these interventions you're claiming are not legitimate. And for the other side that said it is real, they're saying they're all and actually it's very rational. If they from that model where they say climate change is real, it's imminent, and the window of action shows it's radically getting smaller, where we can save ourselves based on these models of argument for climate change, that we need to destroy art to draw attention to it. So basically, there's episodes of people throwing oil and paint, oil on artworks, for example. Edifying art, for me, is the most extreme stance you can take. That's basically destroying beauty. What that tells me, as someone who comes from the arts, that there's something at stake here that's so critical that beauty has to be destroyed for the sake of it, to be drawn attention to it. That'd be an example.
Right, and I hadn't observed the similarity, but as you say it, there is some, like, the most comparable thing to that is different religious sects, like Christians going and just destroying all of the artwork in the churches in order to make it into a Puritan church, or jihadists going and just like destroying all this 1,000-year-old Middle Eastern heritage in the name of monotheism. Like, it has to be a really, really deeply held belief. And it's not just a belief, it's a belief that kind of sinks into and saturates your ontology. If you believe the end times are imminent, and this is something we should definitely talk about, because I've encountered so many people recently who are voicing that. If you believe the end times are imminent from a climate change perspective, that's going to shift your whole landscape of priorities.
Yeah.
And also it's going to probably have a big impact on your nervous system. And if you don't, then A, it's business as usual, and B, you experience possibly the rise of some new totalitarian threat. And that's what the counter climate change, that's kind of the peak expression of the counter climate change position, is that climate change advocacy is going to lead to a kind of global control system. A globalist system of control is going to emerge out of the sense of emergency in a similar way to during COVID, for example. So not to labor that point too deeply, but I think that gives us a helpful analogy outside of the religious question to start to sense into the stakes involved between peoples who have either a view of God and no relationship to God whatsoever, or people who have differing views of God, which are deemed to be highly consequential. Because whilst whilst political differences have enormous implications for this life, religious differences are seen to have implications for eternity, or for the afterlife, or for the well-being of one's soul, the prosperity of one's soul beyond this life, even to the extent that this life can become diminished in significance in relation to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, could I just riff off that point about the climate change throwing oil on artwork point, but then I'm chewing on it more. Actually, I'm feeling stronger and stronger about that point because, as you brought up, the destruction of the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan, for example, iconoclasms of the history and time, even the destruction and removal of statues in America. So, and it's funny because I think a lot of people, the beautiful has always been dismissed as the most fleeting, the most arbitrary, and the most preferential, like just preference based, just arbitrary, and the most flippant of the transcendentals. And in fact, there's some belief. There's a lot of scholars who don't even accept the beautiful as a transcendental. They don't even accept it. They'll say oneness is a transcendental, being is a transcendental, truth is a transcendental, and goodness is, but beauty, no, they won't accept it. So there's a lot of skepticism about it, but these examples are drawing out that actually I would say when the beautiful is being destroyed, purposely being destroyed and attacked, that's a really deep ontological sign that we're not even dealing with just belief systems. We're dealing with ontological viewpoints and collisions of that. Because the fact of the otherness of this thing that needs to be destroyed is so powerful, we must remove it. It's not even permitted to exist. It has to be removed. I find that a very telling sign right there. Because a lot of people, as I said, would dismiss it. They would say, "Oh, it's just a statue, or it's just art. Who cares?" But actually, no. It's actually because that destruction of the beautiful in that way, is something pointing at something, a very deep ontological striking is occurring. Of not just viewpoints, but orientation to reality itself. And as you said, and I'm bringing this up, and I'm using the climate change kind of slightly intentionally to show this is a religion for them. No, it is, because it has the same operation as if it was a religious orientation. But they, of course, they would claim they're not, right? But their modes of behavior and their zealotry about it would tell me that it is. It's their entire orientation of how they live their lives.
Yeah. I mean, it's some form of cultus, certainly. And therein lies the problem for us, or for some people. Yeah, I won't say for us, because I don't, I have mixed stance on this. But it definitely bears the resemblance of a cultus in the degree of devotion to action and service of what's perceived to be true, even in contravention to all social norms. But it doesn't hold the full spectrum of a religion in the sense of core rituals that seem to define and instantiate the belief system into the day-to-day. It's not clear that it has it does have a historical narrative about how man has been kind of parasitic on the planet and things of that nature. So, and does it bind people together? Yes, it does, but in opposition to that problem or and working together against that problem. So yeah, it's an interesting point. I'll take it on.
Well, to build on that, I mean, that's the point, is that it's an empty category. Like, if you actually push on the point, you'll realize that it's an empty container. It's an empty reference. The spiritual substance of what's going to be claimed pushed is some kind of dignity, if I had to really push hard on the point. And the problem is, as I really agree with McIntyre about this, that dignity is secular society's attempt to deal with not a way to bring back justice, the virtue of justice, back into a moral category, but it doesn't work. And actually, that's why it's really interesting. And see Catholics talk about this because, recently there's been this document about human dignity being emphasized so much by the recent Pope. And it's an interesting tension point because thinkers like McIntyre would say you can do everything that dignity is trying to claim, justice does from a virtue ethics point of view. But if you don't have that, because you don't actually believe in a divine source for human beings and our relationship to reality, you're going to use that empty container, an empty reference point, this thing called dignity, which is just which basically just means social agreement, ultimately, when it gets pushed, comes to shove.
Because they don't have a divine root there's no ultimate context, there's no ultimate root. It's like if you dig down deep enough, there's some like self-referential spot where it doesn't hold true, it doesn't continue beyond a certain point.
I mean, to get really theological about it, it's converting basically God's power of speech to be demands. Meaning when God says be, it's be. That fiat power of God's speech creates, it generates in true reality. The theological kind of, I would say, is that secular people try to validate same man as God by saying by us having power of fiat, we can make things be.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about recently, and I'm not sure how this is going to connect immediately, but it's a curious point, is that the notion of the fear of God is said to be very important to wisdom. And the fear of God is instantiated in Christianity, and I'm sure it's instantiated in Islam too. And yet recently, when I'm having some very intense storms out here in Oaxaca, I'm thinking to myself, my relationship with God is much closer to love and peace. It's hard for me to connect with that notion of the fear of God. But when I sense into the climate, when I sense into the sort of hell that can be created by climactic destabilization, that does produce fear. Like, it doesn't take much of a intense flood or lightning storm or drought for me to feel a fear of God. And so I started to then think, well, perhaps then there's this way in which the climate problem could be a kind of theological fissure that's occurred, in which God has been moved into this kind of simply into this transcendental realm and separated from the earthly realm, from what New Age people call the Great Mother, from Mother Earth, from the spirit of the land and the indigenous sensibility, the spirits of the sky, the spirits of the weather. These things were very foundational to a lot of pre-Abrahamic religions, from my understanding. But with Christianity, God has kind of moved up and out of that. And then this kind of like secular materialist development has like progressively, in some way, removed God from the earthly domain. And so whilst we don't fear God, we probably should fear what happens when the earth that supports us is no longer aligned with our well-being. I think we should fear fucking up the ecosystem, fucking around with the divine earth in such a way that it ultimately starts to turn against us, because that can be very disastrous very, very quickly. But there's some theological reweaving that needs to occur at base for those things to be reconnected.
I mean, it goes to show how divorced we put God from reality, in the sense that Noah's flood, like that's a thing, like that's like the world was flooded, and like that's people in Islam, we say that did happen, like we affirm that. That is not a metaphorical, symbolic interpretation. That is our stance that happened. God had absolutely dominion over nature and has acting through nature. But yeah, definitely theological accounts. I would actually even say, I would argue, even from my understanding of Christianity, that the incarnation of the Son is supposed to be the argumentation of God coming to matter directly. As a result, so thus a Gnostic point of view is illegitimate from a Christian point of view because of that. God basically deified matter from their arguments. It's a justification why the defense of the icons was that's what they used, that argumentation, for example. But that just goes to show just like how much of the schism has occurred, where we forgot that at the very minimum, nature and weather was an instrument of God to make judgments and to do things. Destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, for example. Yeah, the flood of Noah. These are all examples where nature was absolutely used to pass judgment and to do things in God's power and will. But the thing you said before that, or is related to that, is yeah, the fear of the Lord, right? Yes, absolutely. Islam would agree with that point. But I think it's a very nuanced point. And I'll use both Aquinas to talk about this as from the Catholic point of view, as well as what it's called the Hadith from Gabriel. So it's one of our more important hadiths. It's from from our prophet having a conversation with the angel Gabriel. And this is the hadith that comes from that. They say, at my reading, the same points, which is Aquinas says there's different kinds of fear of the Lord. There's the serpentile fear of punishment, right? That fear of like basically you're getting punished for doing something wrong, right? That's the first state of fear, first state of fear of the Lord. But then there's another one, filial love, a filial fear of the Lord. What that means is it's kind of the way, if I just summarize what Aquinas is saying there, it's the fear of disappointing or insulting or harming someone you care about very deeply. So it'd be like if you have a child, the thought of you abandoning, hurting your child intently with purpose would be disgust. It would just like you would flee from that because of this is someone you're beloved. So it's a relationship of love. It's like I would never betray my beloved. It's part of the reason why. I remember which one of the disciples, when Jesus in the New Testament speaks, "You'll betray me 3 times," and the crow will cry.
I think it might be Peter.
It's Peter. Yes, like when Peter cries, when in that story where he cries, that's an example of that, where he's realized he's betrayed his beloved. Right. That's a filial fear of the Lord. The Hadith from Gabriel has an analogy. It goes over basically the 3 modes of faith. There's Islam, then there's Imam, and then there's Hassan. And to kind of jump up, Hassan, which means beauty, to beautify. The
Hmm.
language is used there. Conduct yourself as if you're with God with you at all times, with your beloved. And if you cannot do that, at least imagine that he's there with you. It's a similar idea
That would
of
be Islam in this case, or
that. That's a Hassan. So
Hassan.
uh, it's the beautification of the soul.
Hmm.
So this idea of, uh, but obviously the point is like Islam has this idea of observing the laws, right? So there's a kind of that kind of relationship of the filial and the servantile fears of the Lord. Kind of they have a relationship with each other. It's not one or the other; it's both. Uh, but your basic point though, Jacob, about a kind of polarization that matter and spirit has been just schismized, it's completely separated. So we just have dumb matter that that does have no grounds to it. And everything about spirit, it's very Descartesian, right? Kind of like all the mind and the souls over here, and our bodies are just a separation. Um, that's a good example. I mean, when I say like the otherisms of like how different the West, like the modern West is to even the Abrahamic faith in general, this is one of those examples of it because I would say definitely from a Christian point of view and Islamic point of view, and I would say probably strong with Jewish as well. Matter is meant to be sanctified. So the example, the burning bush, for example, from Moses, for example, the bush was not destroyed. Grace does not destroy nature; it perfects nature. Using Aquinas line. Um, all these examples point out that the physical material world is not this like garbage dump of just like stuff we have to run away from. In fact, our job is to sanctify it. That's our relationship.
Hmm.
But I mean, there's lots of traditions that do not accept that. Like these schisms occur. I would totally agree with this point. And our relationship to nature is probably one of those points too, because we're supposed to have there in Islam. We're supposed to have a kind of it's not just we have sovereignty over nature; it's that we have a covenant with nature. We have a stewardship of it.
Hmm.
It's very. I mean, it's a very famous line from the Quran about uh, the kind of it's called the covenant. Kind of translated into English. It was offered to the clouds, to the heavens, and to the mountains, and they rejected it. But Adam took this covenant. What we're getting at here is basically the theological kind of a theological account from Islamic point of view, uh, is to say we have a duty to nature to not just use it to consume it. We have to take care of it. So that's my point, though. Is that's a way we can articulate that in a way that doesn't just take nature to be this dumb, abstract, like useless externalization. Um,
Mm.
Instead,
Yeah,
um,
I can recall hearing about, I'm not sure if it's in the Hadith or the Quran, but there's some injunction, even in times of war, at one point is like when you're going and battling in these lands, don't like damage the trees, don't like kind of profane
mhm.
the nature whilst you're engaged in warfare. Um, I'm wondering then if you've like this strikes me already as something that's I've never heard talked about, but like how does Islam and the climate and ecological crises fit together? And is there a sense in which you feel, mm, I mean, it's complicated because a lot of the Islamic world is at a different level of socioeconomic development, which usually has implications for how people like ecological outcomes. But nonetheless, do you feel like Islam preserves some basis for right relationship with the natural world that maybe is lost in the Western world?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, it's a little complicated because if you look at our examples, look at Dubai. Like these are places of massive artifice. Um, it's not so. It's better to say
And
that I think,
oil.
yeah. Uh, it's not so. I think the ingredients are there. It's in there. but that's no different than Christianity. It's everything. I quote a bunch of Christian examples too. Just because they're there, they need to be activated. This is actually why I think tradition matters. Tradition matters a lot. Like, and that's in it. Obviously there's some, and it's not like Islam doesn't have schisms. We do. There's this whole schism now that's basically it's our form of the Reformation happening. It's the Quran only people. It's and I'm a traditional Sunni in that sense. Like, tradition matters. Like, it's not this, we don't get to just sit and go Quran only and I get to read it myself and use my own interpretation of it. There is that school, there are people who have that school of thought now. That's incredibly dangerous. And I think actually one of those what you're bringing up is one of those examples that the tradition is not just a dead tradition, it's a living tradition. It has to address new problems. There's a reason why, like, my role model is Al-Ghazali. He's the redeemer of the faith. He's a much later thinker in the Islamic tradition, but he was the restorer of the faith. And in particular, his contribution was the integration of the Sunni traditions, the Sunni thought process into the Sufis into the Sunni tradition. That was his major contribution, because the Sufis were around and they were very suspicious. In fact, they still are nowadays within the Sunni tradition of Sufis. Al-Ghazali was the harmonizer, much like Aquinas was the harmonizer of Aristotle and Plato into Christian thought. But that's my point, that he's within the tradition. So he was part of that. He addressed it, and he allowed a certain harmonization to occur. I think we probably need similar processes now, which is hilarious because traditionally, the Sunni schools it's like this locked in thing. But I think tradition is meant to be much more dynamic. It has to be, because we have new problems that we have to solve nowadays. And I think actually climate change is probably one of them. Or at least a different orientation about it. Because a lot of the problems with it is that it's the response to runaway capitalism, in the sense that certain externalities that we can just create plastics like nonstop and not even worry about how we're disposing it, for example, right? Or operating on continuous consumption as a way we're going to manage our economic growth.
Do you take the climate crisis, depending on how you interpret it, is a fundamentally new condition. It's not a condition that was ever a problem for the majority of all of Abrahamic history. There was never a prospect of seriously destroying entire ecological systems with human power. Our externalities just weren't there. We didn't even have plastics. So in that sense, the prospect of destabilizing the natural world, which we can tell a mythic and theological story about as well, that's a new prospect for mankind. There's a new condition.
What kind of bills?
Let me just get to this.
Yeah.
It's like tradition. The basis of tradition is that it has some right comportment with reality. Also, that it's handed down from some greater source. And it's in abiding with that we're able to lead a good life in accordance with, hopefully, virtues like beauty, truth, and goodness, and hopefully in relationship to God. But tradition is also premised on being able to be fitted to the reality around it. And so when you have things that seem fundamentally new or fundamentally new problems coming in, there becomes a question of, is tradition capable of addressing something that was potentially outside the bounds of the founding reality? of the people who birthed the tradition and the evolution of that tradition. So the question is kind of like, is our present condition fundamentally new in respect to things like the capacity to destabilize the entire climate, or the preponderance of nuclear weapons and the capacity to mutually destroy one another at the push of a button, at the push of an escalation? Um, these things didn't exist in the context of any of the traditions. Can they actually adapt to them, or does it imply that there has to be some evolution? And I'm rubbing right on that edge of like, is it evolution within tradition,
Mm-hmm.
or is tradition itself evolving, which implies like something in the foundational characteristics begins to shift?
Well, I would say probably I you understand. I think tradition needs to respond to it, and it has because it has a mechanism to deal with that analogy. So by analogy, you're able to make inferences to new circumstances using prior information. Um, but I think that on the particular point of like what you're drawing out, right? Basically, climate change as well as nuclear weapons, another great example of that. Uh, from a theological point of view, is we're basically because we're messing with nature. We're messing with the fundamental parts of reality to such extent. So we basically entered. We've brought ourselves to this point ourselves. Uh, so I'm immediately thinking of Heidegger's, essence of technology. That's exactly what's going on. Um, what's happened is we've been able in the past, like in the example used from Heidegger, um, you have a river, right, and we have a mill, good old fashioned agrarian society mill, right? You're the argument you're not fundamentally changing the ontology of that riverbank. You're working in cooperation with it. So the intervention of the mill, it's not changing fundamentally what the river is, but we're just pitting it to grind some wheat. So notice both the ontological status of the river has not been radically changed or altered. It's been done in cooperation. And the purpose of that intervention action was for a definite end, grinding the wheat, for example. That's very different from a dam for hydropower. That is radically changing the river. Its ontology has been changed by intervention. And even for the what is it for the sake of has now been changed from a definite end to indefinite. Because it's storing energy that can be used for any purpose, for any desired will. It's been said many times, I think I've heard it before, that infinity is the most dangerous property we ever discovered. That and zero. Those are the most dangerous properties we ever discovered in mathematics. Because that is the domain of God, basically. So once we touch those objects, we mess with them, we're basically now touching God, or working with operations that are really meant to be for God's sake. And so I'm not surprised that we end up where we're at right now. So thus, what I'm getting at here, and then by the way, like these objects, another great example of otherness from the past, from the Greeks, that's a great example. They did not, Aristotle said infinity exists as a potential, not an actuality. But yet the Abrahamic faith, we all agree God is infinite as an actuality. So we've already shown a schism split right there on that. But also zero. Zero didn't exist for the Greeks. They didn't have that. That's an Indo-Islamic tradition, an invention or a discovery. Pick your pick. These are radical. That's the point. We take that for granted. But that is a fundamental different orientation to reality. When you apply that in mathematics, you get all these products, some very, very interesting properties and effects. But these are the consequences that come from that. So it's almost like we've invented a problem we have to now answer ourselves, or our theology needs to now come to bear to address this, if it's even possible.
Yes.
But you don't want to be a fatalistic point. You could make an argument. Yeah, you've touched the elements of God, and now you deserve to pay the price for that. just like I said before, of converting basically God's power of speech, ontological speech, where when God says be, it be. Thus, for example, Islam, we both in Islam and in Christianity, we acknowledge the miracle of Jesus by conception, miraculous conception. That was the power of God saying be, and it was. The flattening of that down to man having that power. That'd be another example of it. So these are not two different modes of the divine being now brought down to man. And when we do that, there's consequences. That would be one way to read that. Now, can we save ourselves to get out of it? That's a live question. I don't have an answer. One can make an argument that we deserve the punishment, we deserve the consequences of that. But on a more optimistic point of view, it means we have to get a better theology. We have to become a better relationship to understanding God and loving Him to address these problems we brought ourselves onto. Or assuming that this is part of our providence, that we have to work through this. That's slightly Hegelian, a very Hegel kind of energy about that. I'm a little neutral on that position, but there's different ways you can interpret the circumstance.
Yeah. It's what I hear in that is there's a way in which the religious standpoint, the traditional standpoint, and more of this kind of whatever you want to call like the game B meta modern Schmachtenbergery kind of emergentism response. There's a convergence there in that they're both saying we're tapping into the domain of God. We're tapping into capacities that are beyond our capacity to really hold simply through our own will and through our own limitations. And we need to connect with greater capacity in order to actually do that. So there's a degree to which they're both saying, we're not going to solve the problem ourselves. We're going to solve the problem in relationship with God, or depending where you stress it, it's through God's will that the impossible problems are addressed. It's not through man's will.
I mean, Bill, what you're saying is I forgot this fact. Like, we are like we're working like the angels right now. You know that, right? In the sense that because Aquinas talks about this, the angels appear virtually. Angels do not have bodies, but they can appear virtually. And that's the thing. Virtual comes from vitus, comes from virtue. Everyone forgets that fact. Because that's the point. Is that literally we're communicating through a bunch of signals of frequencies, right? Of sound and light. This is angelic communication. This is basically not absolutely, because we're not working via concept. We're not just operating without mediation of images of language or whatever. But we're getting there. We're getting there very quickly. But I'm bringing this up to show, like, I just use this a lot to talk about, like, screen use, for example. The evidence of mental health is showing us that we cannot handle this. We cannot handle the virtual. We can't do it. There's because we are not just spirit, we are body and spirit. We're ensouled. Instead of being embodied, we're ensouled. The signs of mental illness is showing us that we cannot handle the virtual because there's a kind of lack of reality to it that actual interaction with nature has. So that just builds on that point of it's not going to be like we need to go back to the divine to restore ourselves, to be able to heal ourselves from this circumstance we put ourselves in. We're trying to be angels when we're just not equipped for it. If I had to summarize the point.
I think that really that furthers the context of absolutely novel circumstances and conditions that we're talking about. Instantaneous global communication and connection and exposure and the saturation of image that we experience. I mean, I heard Zach Stein kind of describe this as like a sort of digital schizophrenia that we're all experiencing. We're all having a really intense kind of bad trip, but because we have this sensibility of like, you know, what's outside is the real and what's inside is not. It's like, oh, that's just subjective reality. But experientially, it's quite similar to someone undergoing a series of disturbing visions at very high speed. And with that, and I know we didn't actually speak about time constraints at the start, so do let me know when is kind of when's your hard stop.
I got a half an hour.
Okay, cool. We can sense into it then. It's I would contend that the intra-religious encounter that's occurring now is part of that landscape of novel conditions. And I know that you are kind of living and standing between the history of where those traditions have met and been in dialogue. And the Silk Road also represents that. But there is something really, really strange and unique about the confrontation with pluralism that's occurring now as well. Which, yes, to some extent, tradition prepares us for, but in other respects, both in the physicality of multicultural global society and in the virtuality of completely interpenetrating cultural spheres, there is this really unique, unprecedented moment of like encountering profound difference. And again, there's like a lack of mediation of that. Like informationally, we can see what's going on in China or the Middle East, but to what extent are we actually, the virtual isn't giving us the ontological ground to really process and understand the difference between one another.
Yeah. There's no equipment. There's no equipment to address that. And
what does that look like? What is that? What is the new equipment of interrelationality in a pluralistic context? And are we generating that anew? Or is the tradition actually holding that somewhere for us? That if we are in abidance with it, we can properly mediate.
One sentiment I do agree with Daniel about on that point. I don't have obviously I don't have a hard answer, a concrete answer at obviously, but it would be beauty. But that's the problem. We don't even know what beauty is. We do not know what it is. Like I said before, it's dismissed as the most subjective, preferential, completely arbitrary mode. Yet, I would agree with Daniel Gardner of OG Rose about this point. It will probably be a new understanding about what beauty is and its real ontological status that would allow that, because the beautiful allows both the most radical, actually, it's a very extreme stance. For example, one is in the past, we've always, at best, have conflated the good to the beautiful. They've been compressed to be one and the same. And people have used Plato as a justification for that. But if you look at Plato's actual dialogues about beauty, there's one, he's used the beautiful in many dialogues, but the one that's explicitly about it, Greater Hippias, which for a long time was considered not legitimate. It was not considered a legitimate Platonic dialogue by scholars, but more contemporary thinkers agree that it is a Platonic dialogue legitimately. It is not. They are not the same. They are clearly, and in fact, actually, in that dialogue, it's super extreme. It's point blank pointed out that the good comes from the beautiful. it generated from it. So they're not even a co-equal relationship. And the status of the beautiful, while obviously in a traditional early Platonic dialogue, you're left in a aporia of, I have no idea. I know it's real, but I have no idea what it is. I think that is absolutely probably the right attitude about it. But in other dialogues from Plato, it's really fascinating from the Critias, for example, about language and words and names. His language of it's when the name fits the thing referenced. It's really interesting, Plato's use of the word. He uses it's cologne. It's not a good word. It's not a true word. It's a beautiful word. Cologne can be translated as beauty. Plato had what I'm getting at here is that Plato's understanding of the beautiful is absolutely not what I was taught in undergrad, or what a traditional, kind of very cursory reading of Plato would make you think. So to kind of answer your question, Jacob, I think the tradition does have it, and it probably will come, in my opinion, of a newer reading of the beautiful. And I say that too because even in the Islamic tradition, one of the ways of actually allowing for interfaith relationships, the divine names. So Dionysus, for example, in the Christian tradition uses that, and in Islamic tradition, it is one of our most well-known instruments of understanding God, is the divine names. And the language of it in particular from Al-Ghazali about it is the beautiful names. So that kind of cologne naming property or element, it's not just a Platonic mode, it's also in the Islamic tradition too. And the purpose of understanding the divine names is to become, it's not just to understand God better, but in Islamic tradition, it's to wear the names. You're to wear it like like clothing, and beautify ourselves in the divine presence, right? In divine participation names. But that's what I'm getting at. So like that'd be like the closest, like that'd be like a spitball first pick. But I'd be first to tell you, to make this stand up to the test of a real addressing of what is the beautiful, and how could we possibly deal with the seemingly wild diversity of it, and subjectivity quality of it, yet penetrative ontological status of it, its relationship to love, and how this coordinates without coercion. Because that's actually a really interesting thing, is that the relationship of the beautiful to love is the idea. It's that, and also is very interesting because it talks with Logos about this, but truth, it's the unforced force. It's sometimes in the Islamic tradition, it's called the compeller, but not a compeller in terms of violence, of coercion, but on ontological, just how could I not do this? One way you could talk about it's like a syllogism by its premises. Like if you accept the premise, the initial, the major and minor premise, you have to accept the conclusion. It's just by necessity, you have to do it. And it's not by coercion, it's just by the raw structure of what's presented in front of you. But in love, it works in a more less mechanical way, but the divine love of my beloved is drawing me to you, but yet I'm not compelled by it. I'm not being coerced by it. I'm compelled to it in a kind of divine inspiration, to use that word. Because a lot of our tension points are about the idea, how do we coordinate without coercion? And more importantly, coordinate without coercion in a way that's not just the bare minimum of the lowest common denominator of desire, consumption. That requires a completely different understanding of the beautiful to pull that off. It's not going to be by the good. It's not going to do it. To quote Aristotle on this point, and very devastatingly in the Eudemian Ethics, the good is the instrument of the mind. Whoops. So that means basically it's an instrument of the mind to draw one towards a certain thing, but it has that construction impositional quality to it. So I would read that, in my interpretation of that, to read that it's not by the good enough, which is very interesting because that'd be normally the answer, is the good is what drives people, will be the driving mechanism of that. I only say that because to draw this point more, for example, when we see art that is propaganda, it's when the good is overpowering the beauty of that work. Like the message is too overwhelming to like its intention of this is the good we're aiming towards, and that That's what propaganda is. That's how you know what when something's propaganda versus art is when that good overpowers. It's like strangling the beauty in the work itself. So maybe that work is actually very formally competent and done very well. But when it's propaganda when the good strangles it too much, uh, imposed onto it. That's the draw what I'm reading what Aristotle means by that term. The good is an instrument of the mind. Um, I feel like you're smiling a
Mm,
little. I feel like you're resonating a little bit on this discussion on the beautiful.
I do. I feel like we've really come somehow full circle without planning it, but this really gets down to the meat and vegetables of precisely where I was hoping we would get to in this conversation. And it does feel like that the true is so contested. Like the between Christians and Muslims, the truth of Jesus or the truth of Muhammad's revelation, like that's a really tough start point, and it's not exactly clear how you even begin to mediate something like that. The good as the problems that you've outlined. The beautiful is a less direct, but in some sense, really deep way in which one becomes intimate with whatever one encounters to be beautiful. And so I can't actually, like, if I approach an aspect of a tradition and I experience the beauty of it, it's very difficult for me to then maintain that like complete separation
Yeah.
that is it seems to be part of the basis of total conflict. Um, and I think this is definitely true of both Islam and Christianity, that part of what seemed to be, how like beyond like very primitive kind of missionary propagation of a faith, it's in beautiful conduct. It's in how you comport yourself beautifully in the world that you become the invitation of people to God. Um, so I think that's a really good start point. I think that's probably a key start point is if we can have and it requires the going beyond ourselves, beyond the boundaries of those clans and those groups. It's very easy it's easier to come into appreciation of the beauty that you are um, more familiar with in a religious context. At least that feels true for me. Like even having been atheist for so long and gone on this whole journey, eventually something like Gregorian chants, something like the beauty of a church, a cathedral, there's a resonance and there's a capacity to connect with that. And as we kind of break out of this very heady, rationalistic period, people are coming back to recognize, oh, this is a really big piece of what religion's about, is aesthetic and the experience of beauty and the creation of divinely inspired beauty. But for me to then go and appreciate the beauty of a mosque, appreciate the beauty of um, collective prayer, appreciate the beauty of songs of recitation, there's a deeper level of intimacy with the tradition, and I 100% believe that that's the foundational basis of a conversation. And I've seen the trajectory from not really having a conversation to, okay, I'm talking about God and you're talking about God as you experience it, and it's in different context, but we're kind of talking to each other. There's some signal getting across now. Like I think there's a need for kind of courageous outgoers who undergo the process of discovering the beauty in other traditions in order to become the basis of that interchange and basis of that dialogue. But then there's still limitations to that. There's limitations to that. There's places where difference doesn't get resolved.
But that's kind of the point, is that, well, two parts of that. Because one is, it's funny because I would say a lot of people, they take what they have as traditions for granted. They can't see the beauty of their own tradition at first. They have to come to, sometimes from looking for external traditions to see that beauty first and then come back to theirs, or a new understanding of their own tradition. I only say that because, ideally,
has that been the case for you? I also want to ask that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Also, I'm a weird. My background biography is very bizarre because, I was raised in a half Catholic, half Muslim house, but as a result, the decision was to not teach the faith. So I was not raised with that growing up. So it's kind of just a nominal, kind of just like nothingness, basically, secularism. It was only later in my life that I got religious, and it originally came from philosophy originally. So actually from reading Plato and Aristotle, actually Aristotle particularly, that my faith got enlightened by that. But yes, finding the beauty in the mosques, right? For example, in the prayers, in the divine words, in the divine works. And in fact, actually, one of my long-term projects is to, basically do the recitation schools for the Quran, because, the language, the discussion of the Quran being a miracle is actually an argument of beauty. Because they say because it's claimed that the power of that Quran, if you know Arabic, is a work of art of such a magnitude. It's basically like a Mona Lisa in your hand. That's the argument being made. But you have to know just like an artist has to know, only an artist knows another artist in terms of what excellence is, because they're actually in a discipline. The Quran has that miracle, and that in its structural linguistic presentation requires you to be someone who understands Arabic in that sense. And also remember, because modern Arabic, like Egyptian, for example, or Lebanese, is not the same. It's a different kind of Arabic, because it's been kind of stamped in time. So it requires an appreciation. That's what I'm getting at. So like the problem with beauty, especially, is that, actually to really penetratively understand beauty, it requires training of the soul to access it. It always was there, but it's no different, because beauty is a demonstration that our souls are instruments, and we need our souls to be calibrated to resonate with that signal. So basically, what I'm getting at here is, but that's no different than truth, quite frankly. Because, for example, if I never studied chemistry and I saw the chemical structure of a very complex biochemistry compound, I'm not trained in that account, that logos. I cannot comprehend it. I don't understand it. But if I was trained in chemistry, I would comprehend the logos of it. I totally get it. Would we say that me not knowing biochemistry means that's not real, that compound? No, it is. Mm-hmm. I just don't have access to it, because my soul's not been cultivated to have that knowledge. So beauty is actually the most extreme example of that, because most ideally, everything's beautiful in God's eyes, because it's God, because it's from Him. So everything has beauty, just in different participations of it. But of course, we can't see that. But with cultivation and training, we can over time. And I'm bringing this up to say that a lot of times, if you're born in a tradition, you kind of blaze it out because it's a given. You don't even realize the beauty behind it. But when you come back to it, especially if you left it and then come back, you realize the beauty of it. Yeah, and I agree. The Gregorian chants, the cathedrals, very beautiful. It's this kind of it. When we're saying this, it's probably the hardest demand we place on ourselves by having to do this, because it is the most demanding beauty. It actually is a very famous line at the end of the Greater Hippias, where it says, all things that are beautiful are the most difficult. That's the line from Plato. That's how he closes it. I think that's really quite true because because the beauty is not because that's the thing is like beauty has this power when you're trained and you're a devotee of it. It has a compelling force on you in the sense of is what like every artist when they're making their work and it's not there yet. They know it. There's a struggle. There's this kind of tension of I know there's this beauty I'm aspiring for, but it's not there yet. And you're almost in pain of talking about it or trying to reach it, even when at your limit. That's a very high demand, which is funny because I think that it's so antithetical to the understanding of beauty as this kind of like pleasurable experience of consumption. Um, of course, that's in the project of generating it, but it's like that's an act of labor of generation. Versus, of course, that's what we have to struggle to do when we try to communing with God in that way, because that's how lacking we are. Of course, when God creates things that are beautiful, they just are. The eminent. That's always about beauty. Is that it has a definite excess that nothing we do can ever even come close to in a weird way. That's actually part of the reason why I say the Quran is a miracle in that sense, because the challenge a couple of times is have man or a jinn try to reproduce this. What it's getting at is anything we produce, even our greatest pieces of literature, have only so much, they have a lot of polysemic depth to it. Which is funny because usually the beautiful is always that one of the challenges of the arts is saying, oh, because it has multiple meanings, it's therefore not reliable. It's actually the opposite. If it has just one reading and one understanding, it's dead. Versus a polysemony of a kind of diversity of gemstone of reality, that the real penetrative depth of reality is because it's multiplicity of its generative power. And when mortal artists try to do that, we struggle, we suffer so hard on that. But when God does it, it's just effortless existence. It's so outstanding. Like think of a gorgeous sunset, right? It has the beautiful always has this power of definiteness. Beauty does not exist at some abstractional point of like sunset. It's this sunset. It has this hexity to it. I always find that very amazing. Only because it just shows how magnificent God is, right? That God can do this. And yet anytime man tries to reproduce that, only few of us ever even come close to it. And even then, very lacking at the same time.
I find yeah.
Oh no, just to close on that point, because I want to at least circle back to what you were bringing up, that interfaith discussions of and we're if to really understand beauty and then use that in a dialogos conversation, this is beautiful. You know how powerful that is, but how dangerous that is at the same time. Because it seems like if we put a proposition or put a statement to it, is that beautiful? That's such a crazy, in one sense, it's so extreme of a statement to make. Because it's like, well, what do you mean by that? And that's what I'm getting before. That's what I was saying before is that a dialogos of like different faiths working together would probably require a deeper understanding of the beautiful. Because if that is that measure to in which we can come to true unity in diversity, right? It's going to require understanding of beauty as the unit, which is, I'm going to tell you right now, I have no fucking clue. Like I'm telling you right now, like I can give you some properties about it, but that's no different than, quite frankly, like just because you know much of the qualities about a thing does not mean you know the quiddity of it. So that's the challenge I'm bringing in my mind thinking about this. I think it's a fun challenge. I think it's probably the best thing you can do with your time is to think about this kind of thing or to process it. But I'll be the person to tell you it's definitely challenging.
Yeah, I feel like a discipleship of beauty and the way that you describe it, the difficulty, the painstakingness, and the devotion involved all feels very beautiful. And that feels undoubtedly like a pointer in the right direction, not only in respect to intercultural dialogue, but really the restoration of our own culture. And I have had countless experiences recently sitting in a church to pray, sitting in a beautiful cathedral to pray in Oaxaca and watching the people trying to connect with the sacred whilst watching people mill through and capture pictures of it on their phone, look down, feel like they got it, and then walk out. And it's just such a profound loss of what the depth and power of that experience is supposed to be. And so that feels to me like an enormously high priority for us, you know, even without addressing all the mega problems we've spoken to. Like, can we just get back to a place where the beauty of experience and the beauty of the sacred is reopened to us baseline?
But it's funny because they're connected, because what we're talking about there is the power is like a bit, it's awareness, attention.
Mm-hmm.
There's this is a, this is not to be developed much further, but there, my reading of Plato in particular leads me to conclude that the unit of intelligibility is the beautiful. What I'm getting at here is the ability to address truthfully in reality and successfully all these other problems: nuclear weapons, social political differences, ecological disaster. It seems ridiculous to say it. People would laugh when you say this. Oh no, if we understand beauty, we'll actually solve all those other problems. That will just come downstream from that. I actually think I have to flesh this out, but it's because, as you just showed, if people are literally going to beautiful cathedrals and they have to use immediate images of the digital camera, and they think that's the real experience of beauty right there, versus real presence, true awareness, which is what intelligibility is. Because also the thing too is, when we forget that nous, right, understanding. I mean, I guess unfortunately that word understanding got grabbed by Kant and taken in a very biological materialist attitude. But originally nous, what's considered the overlap of the divine and man was nous. Nous is it's kind of social emotional understanding,
Mm-hmm.
with a kind of a striking awareness. So like things like the kairos, like the kind of striking awareness of the moment, happens in the noetic awareness. I would say that even though obviously there's a lot of steps between, the real way we're going to address things like climate change, social political strife, setting actual difference, sitting with it, is a relationship to the beautiful, because we're so divorced of attention, which is ironically, the art training per discipline was based on that. It's based on awareness and attention. That's what its training is for. Aristotle's a line about this, that the true mark of genius is the ability to see resemblances that can come either from God or come from training and perception, training and observation. Those are the two things Aristotle says in the rhetoric about that. So you've thought, I feel like there's a lot going on in the background, Jacob, in your mind right now.
Well, sometimes in the dialogue, I do reach a point where it's like the aporia, sort of this question of beauty, this matter of beauty brings us to that. Um, yeah, no, I just feel like my mind is kind of both saturated and empty at the same
Time.
moment.
That's a great moment to be in.
Absolutely.
Because you know those are the moments of preparation. That's what that is.
Part of okay, there's a piece that potentially brings us a little further together because I was struggling a little bit is like, okay, we devote ourselves to beauty, we devote ourselves to the sacred. We restore our cultures to a place where those things are felt more deeply and informing the way that we govern our lives. But somehow in the midst of that, like we still, there's, there were plenty of pre-modern cultures that seemed to embody those characteristics and still were in this condition of potentially in conflict, and certainly didn't have to address it in the same way because they didn't have the super novel condition of global convergence in one place. And this is where ideas like Teilhard de Chardin's become very interesting for me, is that there may be some beautiful teleology to that convergence. There may be some way in which the noosphere, which the internet is like a, maybe considered like a kind of shitty precursor to, um, for that space to become more beautiful too. And that's a mediated space as well. And David Bohm, the quantum physicist, but later in life proponent of dialogue and dialogos, believed that the process of dialogos, from his standpoint, especially bringing together larger circles of people from very pluralistic backgrounds, could actually begin to address some of this issue. And it seems like realizing the beauty in the process of engaging in something like that would be a really key starting point. Like, first, there has to be a appreciation and discipline of beauty, which is related to sacredness. But if there's no sensibility for the beauty of dialogue, then there's no impetus for insular beauty to come to an appreciation of the beauty of the other. And the beauty of the other is in some ways more demanding than the beauty of one's own context because it demands a sort of mutual transformation. I can't be the same if I really, really start to appreciate the beauty in something that heretofore been completely other to me.
But aren't those related? Because exactly that point is that the beautiful is the moment of striking of the psyche, of the self, by the beloved of the other. So a real discipleship to the beautiful is actually just, you're not permitted, it's the strike of love by the beautiful. So as a result, if taken seriously, you cannot ignore that. And in fact, actually, you're told, and your relationship with dialogos is totally accurate. All my examples before, it's really not an accident. We see these edification, edifying of all these artworks by these different ideologies. When you see that, these are not communities or ideologies where dialogue is going to happen, because they're saying no. They're not even. They're exactly it. They're not being penetrated by the beauty.
Right.
They can't accept it. They cannot be. It's not being allowed in. They cut themselves off from the beautiful, and we see that by their willingness to destroy works of art that are participating with beauty.
Yeah, and in that sense, those are fundamentalisms. That's where fundamentalism of any kind is kind of departing from a fealty to beauty.
Yeah, to the divine. No, I agree with that. When beauty is the measure, like
Okay.
very fascinating instrument, isn't it?
Yes. Here's where I identify the problem with tradition as it stands versus some sort of more of an evolutionary theology. There is a heavy, heavy bias, if not doctrinal commitment, to all of the best beauty already being contained within the given tradition. And that acts as a significant counter incentive to an outgoing that is not just a propagation of we found it, we got it, it's here,
Hmm.
but a genuine encounter. And that's almost how I would distinguish um, missionary Christianity from a Christianity beyond itself. Is like if all the beauty is already in Christianity, then why would I want to go, and what's the point um, in having this encounter with Islam, having this encounter with Buddhism?
Yeah,
It has to
yeah.
be some sensibility of the draw to that, or if the of the necessity of going on a journey, or the beauty of pilgrimage beyond tradition in some sense.
I mean, there's two parts of that. I think one part, I think you're fair, is when a tradition becomes a lockbox of this is the it's been parameterized. This is the limit of what we're going to discuss, and this is what's going to be the limit of consideration. Um, I think that's a fair critique or fair challenge. I would say in general, best to put this. I think the simplest part would be it's a kind of position of arrogance, no, in the sense of like we think we have all the answers.
Bias to
Um,
knowing. Yeah, it's more of a knowing than a not knowing
yeah, they're
faith.
not their orientation to God is actually a little bit more like we've contained God by having a certain understanding. Um, so that's my little bit of a stance on that. Um, I mean, certainly from our perspectives, right? That when we're in the beatific vision, when the resurrection occurs, and yeah, maybe I think that's a fair point. We'll all know the truth then. We'll all know exactly what's going on then. Um,
Hmm.
and we'll be outside time at that moment. But prior to that, uh, we have a different relationship to do right now. But I think also a big part too is the other part to grab onto that, like because there's definitely tension. Like trust me, there's lots of tensions of innovation, right? It's a challenge of innovation within traditions. But the example are, and normally there's been always an attitude that no, the arts or the generation of new works has to be in this kind of like negative state with tradition. We have to take away from it. We have to break away from it. But then I think about the Gregorian, basically the Gregorian chant, Paul Symphony. That was universally accepted. No one challenged that. That was like, yes, this is proper and good. This is beautiful. Uh, so I always look at that example that points out that the modern attitude of beauty of art making that is supposed to be uh, rebellious, rejective of tradition. I think that's only a subsectum of the real tradition of the arts because I think there are art traditions that are within a that are within the within a tradition that don't have to go break it or go outside it to work. Um, So I'm a little, I think it's more like a symptom of a certain cultural historical context versus what maybe was all the possibilities are that are possible. Also I say that because like I was gonna say this before, but I stopped myself because I didn't want to go down this route. But because I got a little nervous, talking about it. But the idea of sacred geometry. So one of the things you'll see in actually almost every single spiritual tradition is some kind of relationship to sacred geometry in their art making. So that would be an example. I don't like bringing that up because that can get converted. They could be misinterpreted as a kind of materialist flattening of a perennialism that like, just follow the geometry. That'll be the end of the conversation. No, that's not enough. But I want to point out that there is some kind of common grammar that is occurring, and sacred geometry tends to be one of the ways it shows up. I guess what I'm getting at here is I don't necessarily think there's a problem people staying in a tradition. I don't think there's actually anything wrong with that per se. I think what I'm getting at more is it's definitely an orientation of do we have all the answers? Because the real divine, I think, participation with the divine is to say, no, we don't. We're not going to have it. Not yet. In fact, it's one of our signs of faith. That's actually one of the properties of it. But we have a certain kind of abiding that we can participate in. And maybe if you want to, you can look at other traditions and explore and interface. I think it's certainly possible because what I'm getting at, because it's not like part of the tension was that it wasn't like in the past different traditions or cultures didn't interact with each other. They absolutely did, right? The Silk Road, they did, but it's only a certain very small percentage of people interacted with it. So that's the problem. Or the difference is that now it's like it's everywhere at all times. The saturation's all over the place for everybody. So that's kind of by nature of that, we have to now build new infrastructures to manage that. I'm kind of tied to that. I'm a little more indifferent or just not really that concerned about the necessity to have everybody like that have to go beyond the traditions, only in the sense that let's put this. That kind of attitude of the kind of the limiting it's probably a conflation of the good with the beautiful. Like that'd probably be my first instinct of what's going on there. So you're already in a bad spot from the get-go because we've already done a conflation that has cut you off from actually approaching this the proper way. Because you know why I say that? Because it's kind of what you said before, Jacob. It's like if you cannot apprehend the beauty of another tradition, and you're only seeing in your tradition only, then that means that's because you're cutting it off. There's a cutoff that's occurred. And my kind of intuition, my kind of suggestion of the sacred geometry would be one of those points to say, well, wait a minute, if all the traditions have it, that means there must be some orientation to the beautiful by that fact. I don't want to stay there because, like I said, that can be very quickly flattened out, kind of reduced down to just larger geometry. Because I've seen plenty of, quite frankly, satanic or radically secularist geometry that is so deafening without beauty. So obviously that's not enough. We can't say that. It's obviously a kind of geometry. It's a kind of, I call it it's sacred geometry because it has a certain relationship to the divine being articulated. It's not just geometry by itself. But I'm pointing out like there's these tension points. I think partly because of the problem with traditions that conflate the good with the beautiful. When they do that, these are the chain reactions that occur from that.
Hmm. Guess what I'm wondering then is being that difference between the original Silk Road condition where you could reliably not encounter anyone of a different tradition for possibly a millennia or a few centuries at least, um, and one in which it's become an inevitability. Um, and one which, at least in this particular historical moment, is producing these tensions, these conflicts, which we're doing an okay job of managing, but also are somewhat seething. If that, like that small percentage of people going and encountering, going and starting to discover that universal grammar of beauty that the sacred geometry is a hint of, like whether that's not actually a really necessary impetus now, um, for respective cultures and traditions, for that to be cultivated, um, as a capacity. And I think that there is already a relationality happening, and I've seen that. Like, I actually think Muslim scholars and communities in the West are way, way, way more active in thinking about what's going on in mainstream Western culture and what's our response to it. And I've seen that they are like right kind of on that in a certain respect. They're always having an event about responding to this aspect of secular modernity or what's the cultural trend or da da da.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not clear to me that that's being governed by this kind of dialogos principle we're talking about. Or not to conflate the two, but the beauty that sees beyond a limited notion of the good, and also the sensibility that dialogos can be a disciplining to the beautiful, and that being rightly disciplined to the beautiful can bring about a resolution to the problem landscapes that we face on this plane.
Oh, I totally agree with you in the sense of like an actual dia logos via the beautiful, like oriented around the beautiful as the measure. That has not occurred yet. I would 100% agree. Um, I think that's how radical it is. That's really thought through. I can't no because as you said, it's when we have seen interfacing occurring, it's almost always that there's some orientation of the good. Nothing wrong with that, but that's just what it's orientation about.
I'm hearing a little suggestion in there, and I want to get clear on it, is that this having a real dialogos on the beautiful is so radical that that kind of thing would potentially be subject to attack and suppression by the fundamentalists of the limited conception of the good.
They couldn't be able to handle it. Yeah. As seen by the destruction of art. Fundamentalism destroys art. That's how you immediately that is not a ideology or an relationship of the beautiful happening. In fact, they have to destroy it. When beauty has to be stricken away, it tells you very clearly there's an orientation of non-being occurring.
I think this turns us towards a really interesting question, which may well be a question for beyond the scope of today, but nonetheless, I'll voice it now, which is, given a discipleship to beauty and given an orientation towards genuine dialogos, what does it mean to come into right relationship or wise relationship with those kinds of actors that you're pointing to? How do you, in faithful commitment to dialogue, come into right relationship with people who may be violently opposed to dialogue? And how does one comport oneself in that, whether it be in some sense that general religious sensibility of, in abiding in beauty, I will be an invitation, and there's a possibility of, graceful conversion, or whether there also be the kind of the firm hand and the boundary and, in some sense, the force, and how does that come together of like what we say no to in some sense, as well as in order to be in integrity with what we're saying yes to. How does that land for a potential line of inquiry?
Very, very challenging one. Yeah, it's a very challenging one, but a very good one. Because it brings up the point, exactly, the unforced force, the compeller, that is the unviolent compeller, right? And it's interesting too, just to chew on that a little bit. I say this a lot in art making, and when I teach my students, art making has love and law. It's not one or the other. You need both. So what we're getting at is that it's not that out of the stance that there is not a direct convertibility of the beautiful, the true, and the good. They're not exactly the same, but definitely in the beautiful, the good and the true abide. I think that's definitely true. What I mean by that is it's a harmonization of both what's true and what's good and also is what beautiful. So beautiful has something extra added on. You can see that also in the Greek, where the noble in Greek for Aristotle's Eudemian ethics is the kata agathon. So it's both the beautiful and the good together. That's what makes something noble. If Aristotle just wanted to say the good, he would have said agathon and call it a day. But the reason that addition of the kalon on top, he's pointing that something's extra being added in. But that's something, again, to be harmonized and to be resonated with. It's a big challenge. I don't have an answer yet, because exactly the tension of, I think a lot of times people think this, like, one mode of beauty is to say it's this very indifferent kind of blaseness of like everything goes, but actually quite the opposite. The beautiful is actually quite demanding. It's actually the most demanding. So what kind of compeller is it? What kind of orientation is it? It's something very, again, it seems at first appearance seems the most delicate and the most fragile, but and taken seriously, it's actually the most powerful at the same time. But that's partly why it's so terrifying to actually try to work with it as a measure, because it seems so on the edge of this is actually going to work. Because actually, it's funny. A lot of times in the both dialogue process, but as well as art making, there's always a tension point where we want to put our will in posing things. We're not comfortable letting things abide, right? Work through with their logic and their structure. We want to impose our will to kind of get in there and strangle it, basically, out of usually insecurity, because we're not feeling confident and safe in faith of what we're abiding in, which tends to be a sign more of our relationship or our residences or ourselves than anything about the outside. But I'll be telling you that it is a challenge. I don't have an answer yet.
And it strikes me that it's like incredibly demanding and requires a kind of, there's like a combination of like an absolute fealty and a forgivingness,
Yes.
in the sense that there's like a not quite reaching it, and ultimately if it was kind of sadistically punishing, you wouldn't have that true fealty to it as well. um and Dialogos maybe is bears out that in some respect as well. Like we try to be given to the dialogue as fully as we can, and in doing so get as close as we can to actually bringing life to what we're talking about, and drawing down like whatever higher dimensional insights are wanting to come through the collective wisdom of the dialogue. But at the same time, it's an art that relies on human beings and our limitations. And so yeah, I
I'm
think it's also very forgiving.
Yeah, I'm reminded a lot of the idea of from Jung about synchronicity as the uncaused connection, in the sense that timing of things are very important for beauty. For beauty, Kisilastes talks about this. God made everything. Everything is beautiful in its time. Um, there's a kind of synchronicity that you could participate in and cooperate with, right? But your will imposing onto it is not going to make it happen. In fact, it can't. This is a very different orientation. Because a good dialogue will do that too. You can't go in with a preset script. Then that's just canned conversation. If there's no surprise, one of the signs of the beautiful is there's a surprise, right? In the sense that there's a revelation that comes out that was not known before, never could be accounted for, and yet revealed itself to you, right? Um, a good dialogue will have that quality, you know? If everything's already pre-scripted, already predefined in this little boundary, then there's no surprise because everything, and if there is any surprise, it'll be immediately dismissed. Thus, the very famous line from Daniel Gardner and Michelle Gardner, which I'm off that doctrine too. Lack is not nothing. So, and when we encounter a lack, if we treat that as a nothing, that means that's an obfuscation. We just put it to the side. We don't want to address it. But lack is an opportunity to realize there's something more. There's an abiding excess, that something's there. It's a present absent. That something's there that you could be attuned to if you chose
Mm.
to participate in that way. Versus saying it's nothing and does not even address it.
Yeah, no, I thoroughly concur. I think the lacks and the absences are hugely informative of the dialogue. And I think what comes to me is that as you spoke to the true relationship with beauty has this surprise element to it. It has this encounter. There's this encounter with beauty, and the dialogos is also an encounter. It's like you're seeing fresh. You're encountering the unexpected, and I would say walking with God for me is also bears out that characteristic of surprise. And if it was all kind of mapped and predictable, it wouldn't be, being a limited being in this kind of grand creation beyond comprehension. And so if there can be an understanding that there's some correspondence between beauty the beauty of God and the beauty of participating in dialogos, then that would be potentially a basis on which people would feel compelled to participate.
Yes.
In
When
the
things
encounter. Oh, repeat that again. Sorry, I spoke over you.
that we spoke at the same time together, because I had it in my mind when you spoke, and I was waiting for a chance to share it. When we're abiding in God, everything's anew.
Yeah, can't think of a better place to leave people hanging
I
on
mean,
the end of this.
we're going a good amount of time, but I do need to run. Yes, but
No, no, this is excellent. I don't want to put more demand on the capacity of listeners. I feel like we've really had a complete journey here, and yeah, my faith in the process of dialogos, as always, continually being restored by participating in this. And this wasn't the dialogue I could have planned or predicted, but it's the best one I could have received. So
I'm happy to hear that. Likewise over here. It's been a real pleasure, Jacob. Thank you for inviting me.
my pleasure too. Great having you, Thomas Jockin. To be continued.